Without further ado, I shall now introduce our next speaker, and we have, and with great honor, we have Robert Wilson. Robert, first thing first, I apologize. It is something like 5 o'clock in the morning in the west coast of America. You got muted, can you hear us? Do you want to send them it? Okay, I think it's a bit muted at the moment. So let me just talk about, right. Okay, so.
Hi,
Hi,
can hear you.
Can you hear me? Well,
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay, because at first I was apologizing for getting up so early on the west coast of America, so it's like 5 a.m. and you was muted. So unless I know you're muted, you wasn't totally mad with me.
It's just an honor to be here, regardless of the time. I wouldn't have missed it.
Okay, just to say that Professor Robert Wilson, founded his career on the belief that maths literacy can be the key of unlocking unlimited potential to differentialize communities. And he's been a recipient of the Mathematical Association of America's Deborah and Franklin Tepler Penny Awards, which honors university professors who are widely viewed as extraordinarily successful and whose teaching effectiveness is proven to have an influence beyond their own institution. So, Professor Robin Wilson, so good to see you again, and the floor is absolutely yours.
Okay, wonderful. It's just a real honor and a pleasure to be here, on this international stage with my fellow Black mathematicians. So let me see if I can get my slides up. Can you all see my screen? Let me find the right button to push to get the show going. Okay, how does this look?
It looks very good.
Okay, well, let's see what happens here. So I'm here to tell you all about one of my Black heroes of mathematics. His name is Bob Moses, and I'm going to tell you his story through my perspective. So I had a chance to work with Bob Moses since I was a graduate student, right up until his passing. And I'll give you more of the details. But he was a mathematician first who got wrapped up in the civil rights movement, and it really changed his life, and it changed the trajectory for the United States. So a little bit about me. There's my family. The kids are a little bit bigger now, but I'm a topologist by training. I love thinking about knots and surfaces and the three manifolds that they live in. A little bit about my background, degrees from Berkeley, Howard University, and UC Davis. I'm currently a professor at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. You can see the sunny weather and the ocean there in the picture. A couple of points about me. I had a kind of formative experience in what's known as Uri Treisman's calculus workshops at UC Berkeley, which got me into the math program there, and on my track to go on to graduate school and earn my PhD. As an undergraduate, I spent a semester studying abroad at the University of Ghana at Legon, and so that was also a real formative experience for me. So, but I'm here to tell you about Bob, and so there is a picture of Bob on the bottom left during the civil rights movement. He was in his early 20s. And then there's Bob on the right around the year 2000. He published a very influential book called Radical Equations, Civil Rights from Mississippi to the Algebra Project. And the goal of the book was to do two things. It was to tell his version of the story of the civil rights movement, because the story of the civil rights movement that's been told was really the media's story in some sense, and not the story from the organizer's perspective. And the media story only showed what was caught on camera. And so there was so much that was taking place off camera behind the scenes. And Bob was really interested in telling that story and also telling the story of how he sees the civil rights movement connecting to this issue of math literacy and why he's sort of dedicated the rest of his life to working in math education. So Bob's radical vision. And so this was from an article that he published in the American Math Society with a mathematician and math educator Ed Devinsky, who was his close collaborator at the time. And the quote says, with the ascendance of information technology and the increasing complexity of our society, mathematics joins reading and writing as literacy needed for full citizenship. And so he published this in 2007, but he started saying this in the 80s. And so, when I was thinking about the conversation at the end of the panel yesterday, right, about artificial intelligence and just sort of where we are right now, the fact that that Bob was thinking about this oncoming information age in the 1980s and how it was going to impact the Black youth at that time who are really struggling to engage with math and STEM. At that point, I don't even know if we had gotten the STEM acronym yet. In the mid 1980s, and so here in 2011, Bob goes on to say, like it or not, history has thrust mathematicians and specialists in math education into the middle of a central American dilemma: the reconciliation of the ideals of the Declaration, oh, there's a typo, of Independence and the United States Constitution with the structures of race and caste and the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. And so I'm going to try and spend the next 45 minutes or so unpacking all of this with you all. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Algebra Project and where we landed, and then we'll go back and talk about how we got here. And so the Algebra Project was the organization that Bob started in the late 80s, and it focuses on this is sort of his radical vision in a box, to have a program that targets the lowest quartile of academic achievement and social and economic status, and with goals to help students in this program pass all their state and federal exams, graduate from high school on time, and get accepted into college without having to place in a remedial mathematics course, because at the time that he started thinking about these issues, at a lot of institutions, 70 to 80, even 90% of students would enter college and not be able to take a math course for credit. They would have to take a course that would prepare them for their first college math course. And then the ultimate goal is to put a floor down on the nation for which no student can go below with respect to their math literacy. And so they settled on focusing on these three different areas: research around curricular innovation and development, pedagogy, and developing a particular pedagogical and educational philosophy, and then the practice part, working with teachers, students, and parents in classrooms across the country. And this third part is really what makes the Algebra Project unique. It's really an organizing effort. So they're also focused on organizing on local and national levels around the country to access math literacy as a civil, around the issue, excuse me, of accessing math literacy as a civil right. And also, he sees it connected to citizenship. And I think, initially, he was thinking about citizenship within the context of the United States, but I think this idea translates globally very well. So let's see if you can hear the audio from this video. After slavery. How's it going? Can you hear it? Can you hear him?
Yeah, we can hear something, yeah?
Okay, great.
Okay, we're not hearing it now.
Can you hear that, Nira?
No, you know what?
Okay. If you can't, it's okay. I can just sort of tell you what he said.
Excellent, excellent.
Okay, so what Bob is talking about is this story about what happened after slavery, and his sort of short 1 minute clip about his vision of the Algebra Project. So after slavery, and it was ended in the United States, blacks were sort of left there with no place to go, and so many folks had to stay where they were and start working for the families that had enslaved them, and they became sharecroppers, where they would work the land and earn just enough to survive, but not enough to get away. And they were stuck in this cycle for several generations from the 1860s right up until the 1960s when the civil rights movement take place. And so Bob is making a connection between the sharecroppers in the 1960s and their efforts around organizing access to the vote to change their and how this would change their reality. It would give them an opportunity to participate in the country in a way that they hadn't before. And so that's where the citizenship issue comes in. And he's making this metaphor between or this connection between the sharecroppers in the 60s and these students in our math classrooms today, and the urgent need for them to access math literacy, to have a chance to participate in society in a meaningful way. And that's a global issue. And so that's the kind of the context of that video. So my background, my connection with Algebra Project and Bob Moses is that I met Bob twice when I was a graduate student, first in 2001 and again in 2003. And my mom actually reached out to me to let me know that Bob Moses was in town and was giving a workshop for teachers. And so I went, and I ended up spending some time with him, and he invited me to visit him in Jackson, Mississippi, where he was teaching high school at the time. And so I went down there and spent some time with him, and in his classroom where he was teaching the lowest serving students in the lowest serving school in the lowest performing state. And so that's where Bob decided to plant himself for about 10 years, teaching at Lanier High School in Mississippi, trying to provide an existence proof that that these students were capable of going from low performing in middle school to working with him for 4 years and coming out ready to enter college without remediation. And so I stayed in touch with the Algebra Project and worked with them in different capacities, since that time. And I'm currently on the board of directors. And so Bob had a huge impact on me. In particular, like, he encouraged me in my dream of not just becoming a mathematician, but becoming a research mathematician who was interested in working on equity issues in K-12 education. And he really showed me that I could use my career as a mathematician and an educator to push for radical change. And that's something that I needed to hear, because I was having trouble figuring out, like, what am I going to do with myself? Like, why am I doing this here in the ivory tower, studying this very theoretical discipline? Like, how is it going to help me make a difference in the world? And Bob really showed me the way. So I'm going to go back now and talk about sort of how we got to the Algebra Project through this story of the civil rights movement in Mississippi in the 1960s. And so the Algebra Project logo is actually a version of the Sankofa symbol. It's not the bird, it's a different Adinkra symbol. But right now, I'm going to do a little Sankofa, looking back to the past to see what lessons we can take from it as we plan for the future. And so Bob passed away in 2021, and this was his lifespan from 1935 to 2021. And so this story will take us from the civil rights movement in Mississippi right up to present day. So he was from New York City, a Harlem kid, and apparently he was quite talented as a youth, because he attended this school, Stuyvesant High School in Brooklyn, where which also has as alums 4 or 5 Nobel Prize winners and a Fields Medal winner. Very prestigious, and to this day, a very low Black population. I think about 1% Black today. And then he attended Hamilton College, where he studied philosophy and French. And philosophy is where he got into mathematics, because he went on to Harvard to study the philosophy of mathematics with a man by the name of Willard Van Orman Quine, who plays a very important role in the Algebra Project curricular philosophy. And so while he was at Harvard, I think his mother passed away, and so he had to stop his education to help out at home. And so he went back to New York, and he started teaching mathematics at Horace Mann High School, which is another elite school in New York. And so Bob was wrestling with his identity as a Black male in these very prestigious and intellectual spaces when the civil rights movement began. And so he was a mathematician and a mathematics philosopher and a mathematics teacher first, who got wrapped up in the civil rights movement. So I'm going to go way back and do a very quick overview of some of this United States history. 1863, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the states in the rebellion against the Union, which meant that that these slaves were now soldiers. And the onslaught of freed slaves rushing in to push back against the Confederate Army is what won the war and ended slavery. And then the 13th Amendment was passed, which declared the legal end of slavery. 14th Amendment to the Constitution gave citizenship to people born in the U.S., including the formerly enslaved, and laid down some equal protection rights and voting rights. And for the next 10 years, we had a period known as Reconstruction, the rebuilding of the South after cities were burned to the ground during the Civil War. And during this period, Black politicians gained political power. We had Black governors, Black senators, and Black congressmen, and that period was very short, and it was ended in a wave of violence and followed very quickly by segregated accommodations and very strict segregation laws that became known as the Jim Crow laws. And so this period lasted until the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act. With the Civil Rights Movement, excuse me, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Act of 1965 provided federal legislation to really end this period. So definitely not so long ago. And then that brings us to present day, where we have what we call the new Jim Crow, which Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, which is a racial caste system that is not unlike the one in the late 1800 and early 1800s that's really based on like mass incarceration. And so back to Bob, the sit-ins woke me up. This is from his book, Radical Equations. And he explains that his life was conflicted as a black man, teaching at Horace at a private school, going back and forth between Harvard and this private school, and then back to Harlem. And so it was really the sit-in movement, and you can see some images of these young people. These were college students and high school students who are challenging this white supremacist system to just sit at a lunch counter and order a burger, right? And so you can see some of the backlash that these students faced, and it caught national attention, and it captivated Bob, and it gave him an outlet for the things that he was feeling that he wasn't able to express in these other environments. And so Mississippi was really like they were the state that if there was any state that was going to toe the line for white supremacy in the South, it was Mississippi. They were going to make sure that everyone knew that this place was a place where there's a phrase if you're white it's all right, if you're black get back, and that they wanted that to be the way forever in Mississippi. And so you can see some pictures of a Ku Klux Klan rally This is James Meredith when he tried to integrate the University of Mississippi and had to be escorted to class every day by federal troops, as if studying isn't hard enough. And then there's Emmett Till. He was brutally murdered at a young age for allegedly whistling at a white woman who, on her deathbed a couple years ago, said that she actually made that whole story up. And so back to Bob. So Bob left Harlem and went to Atlanta, Georgia, to spend his summer there. He was a teacher. He had his summer off, so he went down to spend his summer as his first summer as an organizer. And his first job was at Martin Luther King's office and organization. And he didn't really build a relationship with King, but he met Ella Baker, who he did build a relationship with, and she sent him to Mississippi um, to find more students in the Deep South interested in participating in this protest movement. And so in Mississippi, Bob connects with these local organizers that had been doing this work there for a long time. And it's the person in the big white trench coat with the hat, Amzie Moore, who convinced him that voting rights was going to be a way to make meaningful change in Mississippi. And he was really pushing for this more so than the sit-in movement for public accommodations. And these are pretty different strategies. Sit-ins to try and establish a right for access to public accommodations versus trying to access the ballot box, which is in some ways more directly political. And so the ballot box issue, in 1863, there was, citizens were granted the right to vote. But in the South and in other places in the North as well, they used some pretty tricky tactics to prevent Black citizens from voting. Things like poll taxes, like establishing a tax higher than most Blacks would be able to afford, and literacy tests. There was a famous clerk that would ask Black voters if to name how many bubbles are in a bar of soap before they could register to vote. And you can imagine how that went. And another example is a statement where they had to write a section of the Constitution, and if you're of the Constitution of Mississippi from memory, and if you're a white, then they gave you a very easy section, but if you're Black, they could pull out all the stops. And so the voting rights movement began with with Bob and these two young men in the picture. That was the office there in Mississippi when they began a voter registration drive in 1961, and they were followed by backlash. They were Bob and others were beaten, jailed, and some lost their lives because of organizing folks to register to vote in Mississippi. And so from 1961 to 1964, Bob worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee on this voter registration issue. And one of the things that he points out, very often in his book and in his other speeches, is that the Black community there um, was able to absorb these organizers and provide them food and shelter and protection, and that's how they were able to survive. And he also points out that because these families that lived it, they were always, under the threat of violence, but they also were not always living in fear, right? And so they were able to live full lives, and were able to bring those organizers in. And so this quote here is really relevant for later on. So this was Bob's testimony when he was arrested for organizing voters. I think the charge was disturbing the peace or something like that. And so Bob's point to the judge was that you can't deny people an educational opportunity and then say that the reason people can't vote is because they can't read. And so, the system in Mississippi was denying students access to an education, and then would not allow them to vote because these sort of literacy tests and things like that. And this shows up again in the story with the issue of students denying children and access to a quality math education, and then turning around and say, well, these kids can't do math, right? When all along you've been denying them the same opportunities as other young people. And so I'm trying to give you a very fast version of the story. So this is a quote from an article called "The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's Challenge to the 1964 Democratic Convention," which I'll say just a little bit more about. But so as 1963 fades into history, 1964 dawns with Mississippi's white power structure still continuing to deny blacks to vote. No more than 5% of the state's population have been able to add their names to the voter rolls, although and those few blacks who are registered are shut out of the process, and they face arrest by police on phony charges. They face getting fired from their jobs because the people that own the businesses that employ them are not in support of these efforts, and they place of death by the Ku Klux Klan, and some of these organizers did get killed. And so in 1964, in early 1964, 100 students came from Stanford and Yale to help register blacks in Mississippi, and then they brought 1,000 more students that summer um, from all over the country, mostly white, to Mississippi to help register voters. And they registered 80,000 black voters across the state from January to that summer. But despite the fact that many people were registered, it still was not clear how many would actually get access to that ballot box for the upcoming November election. And so they actually took a different approach at the end of this Freedom Summer movement. So they decided to create their own party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And the idea was that this Democratic National Convention was coming up, where all of the representatives of the Democratic Party in Mississippi would go and cast their vote for the next Democratic candidate for president. And so what happened, what they did was they decided that this actual delegation was actually illegal, and they didn't follow the rules of the Democratic Party, because the way it worked was like, hey, you're my friend, you're a delegate, you're my son, you're a delegate, you're my cousin, you're a delegate. And they did not follow the sort of electoral rules of the Democratic Party, and they prevented citizens from accessing the vote. And so the Freedom Summer delegation decided that they were going to have their own honest elections and elect their own representatives to attend the Democratic National Convention. And they were going to argue that they should be the ones who decided um, uh, Mississippi's voice on the next Democratic presidential candidate. And so this, as you can imagine, there was a lot of this didn't go so smooth. And there was one of the highlights, I guess, of this effort was Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony. So Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper who started attending these organizing efforts. And through this community organizing sort of philosophy, she rose up right out of the masses to become a leader and a lead voice in this movement. So you won't be able to see the video, to hear the video, but it's a short clip where you hear some of her testimony at the Democratic National Convention, and Bob's commentary. He makes the point that so at the convention, Martin Luther King was there, Fannie Lou Hamer was there, many others were there, and King makes a speech, and it goes off sort of without a hitch. And then Fannie Lou Hamer comes on stage and she starts speaking. And so President Lyndon Johnson at the time, who was also running for president, he's at the convention, he hears her speech and he sees where this is going and calls a press conference to take the attention away from Fannie Lou Hamer, because he doesn't want the world to hear what she's going to say. And Bob's point is that Lyndon Johnson wasn't afraid of Dr. King. He was afraid of Fannie Lou Hamer. He was afraid that that her voice and the message that she had to share could really turn the sentiment of what was going on, within that movement. And so Fannie Lou, I think, sort of represents these young students that have been underserved for so long in our math classes, and the potential that they have to use their own voices to demand math literacy and sort of a different type of education for themselves and for each other. And so the turning point for the civil rights movement was that Mississippi uh, uh, Freedom Democratic Party at the Democratic National Convention, because this group had played by the rules of the party, had done everything that they were supposed to do. They had walked up to the face of power and offered an alternative, a legitimate alternative to this, white supremacist terrorist regime in Mississippi, and they were, sent home. They had the door slammed in their face. They were not allowed to be seated and have their voices heard. And so these young people, um, who they went back home and they started things like the Berkeley's, now known as a place for activism. Well, these were students coming back home from Berkeley from the civil rights movement, from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. John Lewis, who made this quote, went on to become a U.S. congressman. Marion Barry went on to become a mayor of New York. Stokely Carmichael went on to become a leader in the civil rights movement and influential in the start of the Black Panther Party and things like that. And so for the young people in this movement, they realized that playing by the rules wasn't going to get them very far. This was the lesson. And so for Bob, he actually ended up um, leaving the United States. He got drafted at the age of 30 into the Vietnam War, and so he left and he went first to Canada and then to Tanzania, and so that story picks up, and that's the story of the Algebra Project. And so Bob moved to Tanzania in '69, and he got a job working for the Department of Education there. Maybe, I believe, was that Jomo Kenyatta? Uh, or Julius Nyerere. You'll have to correct me. But he taught at the Same School for about 7 years, and he went back to teaching math. And while teaching in Tanzania, he says that he learned what it meant for a school system to be committed to its children, to all of its children, and to want all of its children to learn and to grow and to thrive. And so in the '70s, when Jimmy Carter he forgave the draft dodgers and welcomed them back to the United States. And so Bob came back to Boston and continued his work studying the philosophy of math with Willard Quine. And right around that same time, he won a MacArthur Genius Award. And this was in the year 1982. And so what he decided to do with that time, since he had this money, he decided that he was going to go into his daughter's school to teach algebra to her and a small group of students so that they could be ready to take geometry in the ninth grade. And so that's his daughter Maisha, and that's the Same School in Tanzania. And so Maisha was really the beginning of the Algebra Project. And he didn't just teach Maisha's class, he taught his son Omo's class the next year and his son Tabo's class the next year. And before you know it, he's a part of the math department at the school, teaching there full time, and his program expands throughout the whole school. And so he's also developing, this educational philosophy um, that is really centered on mathematizing students' experiences, which I'll say a little bit more soon. And he also started meeting with parents and having conversations about who has access to algebra. And so there's an anecdote that he shares. He polled the parents at the school. He asked them two questions. One, do you think your child should get algebra in the seventh grade? And two, do you think all children should get algebra in the seventh grade? And to the first question, do you think your child should get algebra to the 7th grade? Every parent said yes. For the second question, do you think all children should get algebra in the 7th grade? Well, not many parents said yes. And so Bob took this data and shared it with the teachers, I mean, with the parents, excuse me. And they had to face this bias, right? That this perception that this was something for their own children, but not for all children. And so holding that mirror up, I think really started a movement at that school around access to algebra. And so it brought him back to this organizing place where he found this issue where you could build consensus around this issue that all students have a right to access to algebra. And you know, in middle school. So because in the US, that would allow you to take a geometry class in your first year in high school and make it to a calculus class by your 4th year in our high school curriculum, so you could be ready to step into college without remediating. And so he develops a curriculum that helps students catch up. The students are behind, can help them catch up and get them ready for algebra. And he did this through drawing on his experience as a mathematician and math philosopher. Um, and this project began to grow, not only throughout Boston, but he got funding that sent the project into other cities around the country. And so a little bit more about this philosophy. So Bob felt like that math literacy was working in a similar way as the denial of the right to vote in Mississippi, and that you know, math illiteracy affects everyone, but it affects Blacks and other minorities much more intensely. And without math literacy, um, then our youth are destined to become what he calls serfs of the information age, just as the people working as sharecroppers on those plantations were serfs in Mississippi in the 1960s. And he also felt that, you know, the children are being told that algebra is not for them, just like sharecroppers were being told that voting wasn't for them. And so this is the challenge, trying to convince our nation and these young people themselves that algebra is important for their future, and that accessing this, you know, at a young age, and providing yourself a place to become mathematical literate will put you in a position to access any discipline and any career path that you might desire. And without that, right, then we're really limiting our children. And so he also took a lot of lessons from the civil rights movement and brought them to the classroom. So his mentor, Ella Baker, is there in the picture. And some of the things that she promoted were a movement around relevance of everyday life. And so for Bob, the curriculum had to be relevant to everyday life. The math the students were learning, it was relevant to their lives, that they would be engaged. This idea of group-centered leadership, he transferred to the classroom. And instead of a teacher-centered classroom, we want student-centered classrooms where students are working together, discussing ideas, debating ideas, and building consensus, and deciding for themselves what's true and what's not true, what arguments are valid, and that sort of thing. Um, and this idea about the oppressed advocating for themselves, I think that's really the mission of the Algebra Project. Is for one day for us to see young people telling us adults that we're not doing our job to educate them properly, and for them to really start demanding an access to a quality education. And for Bob, that's when things can really start to change. And so Quine, who was Bob's you know, Bob's mentor in the philosophy department at Harvard, have a very different vision about what mathematics is than I think is popular today. So for Quine, he felt that this idea that that these that this axiomatic approach to math was the ground for math, that sort of these axioms of set theory were the floor for mathematics, and that everything is built on top of that. Or maybe it's categories, right? Category theory, and everything is built on top of that. But for Quine, that was the tail wagging the dog. For him, mathematics gets off the ground through ordinary events described in ordinary language, and then you take that ordinary language, and then it goes through a process and comes out on the other side as symbols in this symbolic representation. But its beginning is in everyday experience and everyday language, and this is very different perspective than this other perspective. Um, and Bob brought this idea into the classroom. And so he felt that through grounding curriculum in experiences, um, and then building the concepts, the math concepts on top of that could help students catch up. If the students had an experience that they could refer to, then they could never get lost, because they could always go back to that experience to get a grounding and figure out which way to go from there. He also took this idea of symbolic reasoning, and offering students the opportunity to come up with their own symbols for these mathematical concepts before we introduce the traditional ones. He incorporated cooperative learning, this idea of student-centered classrooms, and I think this last one can't be understated. Just a belief in an unshakable belief in the ability of all students to learn math at the highest levels. And so what came out of this was what's known as Bob's five-step curricular process, where the students will experience a physical event and then reflect on the event, draw, and as you can see in this bottom picture on the right. So an example of event is this as a trip on the subway. And then the students will draw and represent the event in their own words. And you can kind of see that in that picture, this is the beginning of a number line. And then mathematizing this experience, um, and then developing the symbolic representations of the event. So what you'll end up with is a number line that the students are intimately connected with. And if they sort of get lost when they're sorting out the different things related to positive and negative integer arithmetic, then they can just go back to their trip. And like, well, remember when we were here, and how long did it, how many stops was it to here? And they can sort of use this as a metaphor for their learning. And so a big part of the algebra project was the role that the mathematicians have a role to play in the outcome of this entire democratic experiment here in the United States, because of the importance of this math literacy issue. So Bob felt that that there's nothing in the training of mathematicians that prepares them to lead in such a literacy effort. Yet the literacy effort cannot succeed unless it enlists the active participation of some critical mass of the mathematical community. And so I'd like to think that we're getting there, that because of the book that he put out, a lot of folks heard his call and are sort of, and so for math teachers and mathematicians all around the country, if not the globe, Bob gave us a particular more meaning to our work. Like now, it made it more critical because of these connections. And so these are some of the mathematicians that worked most closely with Bob in the Algebra Project to develop curriculum through the 80s and the 90s. Not all of them are with us anymore, but some of them and are still sort of plugging away. Another example of one of the curricula that came out of this sort of collaboration with mathematicians was this problem called a unit of instruction for teaching about functions through what's called the road coloring problem. So the road coloring problem is now the road coloring theorem, but at the time it was an open problem. And this mathematician, Greg Budsman, invited Bob to come and give a talk. Afterwards, they went out to dinner. Bob asked Greg about his research. Greg draws some pictures of graphs on a napkin. And some point later, they follow up, and Bob follows up and tells Greg, "Hey, I'm teaching students, about about the road coloring problem, and Greg's like, I gotta see this. What are you talking about? He must have lost his mind, and then goes down there and sees a picture not unlike what you have on the right, where these graphs were built with hula hoops on the floor, and students are walking them out. So this is the road coloring problem. Imagine you live on this directed graph, and your friend calls and asks for directions to your house, and your goal is to give a set of directions that work, that will take your friend to your house no matter where your friend starts on the graph. And this is a directed graph with, edges have two different colors that has to satisfy certain properties for a solution to this question to exist. But at the time, it was an open problem, whether a solution did always exist. And students were able to work through these questions in simple examples. And out of this comes a really rich lesson about functions. And so it's just a very innovative approach to curriculum. I'll try and wrap this up because I know I must be short on time. But where do we go from here? So Bob passed away in 2021. We're working to keep Bob's vision alive of raising the floor for K-12 literacy, continuing to support teachers, schools, and districts to transform their practice, creating coalitions, and organizing around other particular sort of sub-movements that Bob started within the project. One is called Quality Education as a Constitutional Right. There's a group that still meets monthly, I think, that's pushing for this idea that one day there can be a constitutional amendment that will guarantee a federal right to a quality education, that the federal government could put a floor on where students cannot go below. Right now, that's left up to the individual states here in the United States. And there are other movements as well that have come out of this. And I think another big part is providing an existence proof by demonstrating that all students can graduate from high school prepared for college math, no matter their prior background. And so one of the biggest efforts that's come out of this is the Young People's Project. This was actually started by some of Bob's children and students that decided that they wanted a piece of this movement too. And so they've created an after-school program that's now national. And one of their flagship programs is related to a game called the Flagway game that is related. It's a math game that's played like on a gym floor, and students run around the track trying to place their flags on different places based on a factorization of numbers. And so they have a national flagway league, and there's a gathering each spring where the teams from around the country will come together and play, and that's what that picture is from. And this kind of gives you a picture of some of the efforts in this little graph here, this sort of we the people movement, of which consists of folks that have worked with the Algebra Project, that have come together and are still working to organize around these issues. And I think I'll leave it here. The Algebra Project is, so Bob was also on the Board of Education at formerly the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute in Berkeley. It's now the Simons LaFleur Mathematical Science Institute after the latest funding change. But the Algebra Project is the lead organizer on a conference there this spring, coming up in April, Critical Issues in Math Education, K-12 Mathematics Literacy for 21st Century Citizenship. And so I want to invite you all to come on out. It's also going to be available virtually as well, so you can register to come out in person or to attend some of the sessions virtually. And so maybe my last thought, I'm not going to get to share this whole slide, but is this a US problem, or is this math literacy for citizenship a global problem for the African diaspora? And what I have was a clip from a film that I saw called Small Acts. It's a series of short documentaries. This one and this short film in particular about education shares the story of a young boy in the UK who's he's been written off and he's sent to a school for kids for special needs, and his educational experience is just horrible until he's put into a program that is really culturally responsive and be put in front of people that really believe in his brilliance, and he's just able to shine. And so it really raised some questions for me about how much this is just a U.S. problem, or is this math literacy for citizenship issue really an issue of global citizenship for all of us? And so I'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, that program, Small Axe, had it told about a certain history that here in the UK amongst the West Indian community, where what they said that they thought that the West Indian children they needed to go for special education. So all the parents who came from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, they thought special schools, that means our children are special, as in clever, but special doesn't mean as in clever means special, as means subnormal in education. And what happened was that there became a realization that this was loads of the West Indian children were being pushed to special needs schools. What was the response was, as actually from the West Indian community in the UK, was to set up what was called Saturday schools. And I had the pleasure of actually working in a Saturday school teaching children mathematics, and it was a very good experience for me. And I know that a number of those children have moved on to better things. So when you say, is it a global problem? Certainly there are, what you talk about there are parallels with what's happening in the UK. Now we do have some educationists in the room, so I'll yield to David, the one that asked the first question. Yeah, or are they shy? Oh, and okay, they're a bit shy, right? I'll ask the first question. So, you know, thank you for going through that history of America and Bob's life. The key thing is, where do we go from here? Do we want to be in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time, talking about exactly the same thing over and over again? When do we actually go for? When do we actually change that paradigm and saying, right? Because I don't want to be. Really want to be talking about the same thing. It's positive that we're moving forward, but I don't want to be a case of 5 steps forward, 4 steps back, 5 steps forward, 4 steps back. How do we actually change this paradigm?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Nira. And you know, I have to I'm thinking about Bob because he thought about this in the book. And actually, you know, in some of our conversations, he shared about the time frame of this issue. And he talked about that moment around voting rights from 61 to 64 and how it happened so fast. And in reflection, he felt like they went too big, too fast, and burned out. And then after they were turned away at the Democratic National Convention, they didn't want to go. No one wanted to go back to what they were doing before, that slow organizing work. And he felt like that was where things sort of started to fall apart. So with the Algebra Project, he's planned for a very long-term effort. He's planned for this effort that would continue after his passing. And you know, he said that you know, I'm not sure where we are right now in this freedom struggle. I'm not sure if we're even in the middle. We might still be at the beginning, right? And so it's really got me thinking about the time frame of these issues. And so anyhow, I absolutely agree with you. We don't want to be here where we are a few years from now talking about the same conversation. But I guess the way we get there is through that really long-term planning, and not immediate gratification, you know, isn't always the most effective, right, way to get where we want to go. But working together and really continuing to push for these issues, looking for opportunities like the moment that we're living in now with the rise of artificial intelligence. It's a moment that everyone will understand this issue on how critical math literacy is. So maybe this is a time when we can make some big jumps forward. Or maybe here in the United States, if the right person ends up in office and we're able to push the right buttons in the right places, maybe we could get some federal legislation across that would provide some backup, right, for a place that we could call when we could say, you know what, this school right here is not doing it's unconstitutional because it's failing these children. So you need to send someone out and fix this, looking for places where we can get in and make some progress and sort of always staying vigilant and staying ready to keep doing this work to look for those opportunities to make positive change. And then in an international level, that's another question that I'm just starting to wrestle with that I would love to continue, connecting with you all around.
Well, I'm just going to end this on a positive note, and it's just something to go on small acts, is that yesterday we had one of our speakers from one of our sponsors, and he was talking about the organisation that he's representing. Now, but his story, his name is Dr. Howard Hewiton. His story was actually very interesting because they thought when he was about 12, 13, that he was actually he was educationally behind, and they would send him to a special school.
Mm-hmm.
And what he did, he escaped and he would run off into libraries, read about math books, and he read about all these mathematicians. So much so that he went off to university, got his degree, got his PhD, runs his own finance company, and now he sits on and he did a lesson. He talked yesterday at the Black Heroes Mathematics, saying about why the Black Heroes Mathematics is a good conference. So we want to follow the vision that Bob has done, and we're going to keep on fighting for it. But Robin, thank you very much indeed for that.
Thanks to everyone. Thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead. You got a question coming in?
Yeah, it's totally inspiring. I'm wondering that, I haven't heard about this. I did hear about it once, but it hasn't kind of taken me that I've managed to investigate it further. But I totally take that this is something that I would like more people to know about. So hypothetically, let's say you had a room full of Black heroes of mathematics somewhere, maybe in London. What would be the kind of first few steps that we could take to start supporting with this?
I think a great thing to do if you haven't yet is to check out that book, Radical Equations. He has a pretty it's just the story that I told, but from his Bob's perspective, and it's really captivated the attention of math teachers and mathematicians all over this country, and it sort of brought folks in. Another thing to do is to come on out for the workshop in Berkeley. If you can't come in person, then sign up and drop in on some of the virtual sessions, and also reaching out to the Algebra Project to make connections. So I guess the Young People's Project, I just found this out yesterday, that they were in Ireland last month sharing their model they have a model called math literacy workers, where they try to give young people jobs, like young people, like high school students and college students, jobs teaching math to people younger than them. And so apparently in Ireland, there's something called a gap year that a lot of students do after they graduate from high school. They brought the Young People's Project over to share this math literacy worker model as something that young people can do with their gap year. And so, connecting, let's connect and keep these conversations going.
Okay. Yeah. And to connect with the Algebra Project.
That's right. And thealgebraproject.org, I think is algebra.org is the website.
Well, Robin, hopefully we got a whole set of UK Black Heroes of Mathematicians around the world coming to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right.
Thank you very much indeed, Robin.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.